Hello, I'm Alistair McIntosh from the Housing Quality Network. We've got a great guest this week. It's Dorian Leatham. I'll introduce him in a second. We didn't do a first things first this week because we were far too excited by the Olympics. The thought of all those cyclists going round that little Scalextrics track was just much too much for Max and I, and we couldn't concentrate. So anyway, here is our special feature for this week. Dorian Leatham is with me. He's been the chief executive of a major London borough and a housing association, undertakes consultancy projects of various forms at the moment. I've known Dorian since the 1980s, so it's great to have him here. Just going to ask Dorian a couple of questions to kick things off. First is, Dorian, you've worked in housing on and off since the 1980s. What are the biggest changes you've seen?
Numerous changes. One, I think, is the growth of the big RSLs.
Yeah.
I think, considering that Mrs. Thatcher wanted to break what she saw as the monopoly of local authorities on housing, we now have mammoth housing associations, mostly led by chief executives of financial background, although our friend at London and Quadrant has just stood down, rather interestingly. So I think that's one massive change. I think the fact that in terms of leadership, it's interesting to see the number of women who are now leading housing associations in particular, as well as in local authority housing. And if you think back, it used to be the white men in white shirts and grey suits, going back the time. Yeah, there you are. But even though there's that jump in terms of equalities, what does sadden me in terms of, is it a change? Yes, there are a lot more people from BAME communities working in housing associations and local authorities, but who's at the top? Who's at the top? And it's still mostly white people. Obviously, we've got Gita at Metropolitan and one or two other, you know, and sadly, Sharon just left, not Gateway, not Abinteg, yeah, you know, but there are so few people of colour who actually lead in associations, both within Greater London and outside of London, and that's hugely disappointing. I think that certainly the skill sets which are used on both local authority and housing associations is much more enhanced these days. But again, if you look at all the adverts for governance, it is mostly people, risk, audit, financial backgrounds, legal backgrounds. The days when someone with a very generalist background could get in as a governance or a trustee, those days seem to have receded. I think the other thing is, I'd like to believe that the leadership of organizations, the business leadership skills, have got that much sharper because they have to. They are big monolithic businesses now. I also believe one of the big changes, which still has a long way to go and sadly was probably jolted by the death of George Floyd, is that in terms of equalities, diversity, that organizations are actually paying more attention and actually trying to do the right thing. But I know there's still a long way to go. Pro rata, if you look again back to the point I made earlier about how many people of colour at senior positions, but that's both in local government and in the housing association world.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for that, Dorian. And the next question is, and this won't be a shock to you, how do we get back on track after Grenfell and the exposés on ITV News recently?
Right, I think with great difficulty. Despite what I just said about leadership sharpening, I think that what you need to do, organizations need to do, is get much closer to understand what their residents, tenants, their consumers want. But especially with the big housing associations, there's a whole issue about financial management and its financial position. And I actually think that not just because of what's happened at Grenfell, but I think because we're in this thing known as coming out of COVID-19, every organization is looking about how it delivers its business. It's going to have to look at its finances because costs of all delivering services are increasing. And I think the big issue is how staff and organizations listen. Now, I talked about the monoliths. So if you are Southern Housing Group, where your headquarters is in Farringdon, you have stock on the Isle of Wight, or if you are Places for People and you also run a leisure industry, leisure business, you know, what really is your focus, you know, and how can you ensure that your staff are truly listening and responding and living up to the values that you have set? Equally, I think, because of that vastness, how are we listening to the staff? So there's two things. There's definitely the consumers of services. There's definitely about listening to what your staff have to say. And I think the issue that's in front of organizations now is that, yes, there are the financial objectives. Yes, there's a service delivery objectives, but I don't know to what extent they will be responding to what's come out of the white paper in terms of getting closer to tenants. I think obviously in terms of talking of the white paper, all the issues around health and safety and building, that will take place. And probably going back to your first question, I think one of the big issues that will arise that organizations will have to is that whole energy, the environment and energy issues, the environment, looking at housing in a whole. I think ironically that it is a conservative government which is bringing this in, that, you know, housing associations and local authorities will have to do that. But we are caught in a trap, isn't it? Because there's cuts and cuts and cuts. But I think COVID has taught us that there's different ways of communicating. You don't have to physically go and see a community. You don't have to all that is good, especially for the elderly people and people who are vulnerable, whether it's age or because English isn't their first language and so on. So organizations have to look about how they overcome those. So my own view is that especially the smaller RSLs, have they got the skill sets within them to rise to the challenge? And I'm probably going to speak out of turn now, and I'll be pummeled for it, but not for the first time. I don't know to what extent, because of their size, some of the smaller, the G320s, you know, the BME Londons, you know, whether they will be able to garner themselves and actually instill a new ethos coming out, which is expected coming out of the white paper. So that's an issue for me. And I think in terms of how we actually interact, listen, and respond to tenants right across the piece, I think that's also going to be an issue. But we are better than we were, Alistair, 30 years ago, I think. You know,
I mean, you will recall, Dorian, we were right on top of Somers Town. We were physically opposite it, and we did an appalling job of managing it. So progress has been made. Interesting point about the large organisations and the small ones. As you know, we run this Young Leaders competition. They've all sent their blogs in, and quite a number of them were looking at how you harness the power, the almost Amazon-like power of the big associations, yet use that to help the smaller local associations that are closer to the community. So we'll be putting those blogs out over the course of the next week, and it'd be good to have your thoughts on that. My final question is this, Dorian. We're working with quite a lot of young leaders at the moment, just you know, folk like we were in the early 80s, yeah? What tips would you give to them today?
Right. Well, do not follow the man who said, only I can solve it. Okay, for sure. No, well, that is a serious comment. I think what's critical in leadership is communication, definitely. Because in any relationship, whether it's on a one-to-one or far more than one-to-one, how you communicate and get people to engage and believe and want to work with you is critical. I think you've got to learn, and you don't just learn by staying within the confines of your own organization. There are good examples of how to do the business, the social business of housing right across the board. I think personally, for a long, long time, London housing organisations had this kind of elitism. We're London and we know best. And in fact, there's some fantastic practices taking place and being delivered from the Bristols of this world, you know, to Manchester, to Nottingham, where my old sparring partner, Mr. Langstaff, was. You know, there's some excellent practices. And so we've got to learn. And I think it's ironic that we're having the discussion at the time of the Olympics, because what do all those athletes have? They have a coach, they have a mentor. But what do? They practice, they learn, they practice, they learn. So it's no different if you want to aspire to a leadership position. And that leadership doesn't mean that you become the chief executive necessarily. Leadership is doing the right thing in being an area manager or even being a team leader. I think that the other thing that you need to learn is that some of us make errors, okay, as we're trying to deliver the service. And everyone has areas for development. I don't call them weaknesses, I call them areas for development. Going back to the Olympic bit I mentioned, athletes have areas they need to work on, and you work on it and you develop. And I think you need to learn that you don't go on a course simply to improve. So in my time, I shadowed Sir John Egan, right? I shadowed Richard Branson. I went up to Liverpool. I went to Kirklees. I went to Bristol, and I just spent a day or two in these places and just picked up some great ideas. And even if you come back with just that much, yeah, that you didn't know before, that is an improvement that you can put into yourself and into the organization. So there's no boundaries to learning. And I think the other thing is that if and when you do make an error, you put your hand up. The worst thing you can do as a leader, would-be leader, is try to deny that you failed. I mean, there are many, many more aspects to it, but I think that the other issue, which I did do as I came up the ladder, I didn't just stay in local government. I actually looked at what's happening in the private sector, and I learned about new techniques. So, albeit I was already a chief executive, but in terms of improved procurement in Hillingdon, that's because I went and learned what they're doing at BAA at Heathrow, which is fantastic. And we brought it into the council. Equally, they knew nothing about EDI, and so we taught them about EDI. So, you know, there are swings and roundabouts. So communications, get a coach or a mentor to help you learn and understand what's happening in other organizations. And I mean, I've also had the pleasure of going to other countries in Europe, and I went to Canada. So, you know, there are practices that you can learn by not just thinking, I'll stay within wherever I'm being paid.
Yeah, great stuff. So work hard and keep looking is the message, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, hard work never hurts, quite frankly, but it's also about being honest with your staff and being honest with yourself. And you have to have times when you're reflecting about, could I have done this, whatever it was I was doing today, better? And I'm probably my own worst critic, and sometimes you have to be your own worst critic.
Yeah. No, it's a good point to end on, Dorian. So thanks ever so much for your time. And you know, if people want to talk more with Dorian, and I hope you do, then just get in touch and we'll link you together. So thanks, Dorian. A pleasure.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you.